4:08 now. Just before that last newscast, I told you that concerns now in China, where they're starting to bring a lockdown in parts of Shanghai. Shanghai Disney will be closing, as will some schools. So what might the situation be? Is there another wave on the way? Who better to answer that question than Health Secretary Sajid Javid, who joins me now, also to tell us that there is a new COVID booster effectively on the way. Let's start, if we may, Secretary of State, with that. Who are you calling upon to step forward for effectively their fourth jab? Good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning. Look, our vaccination programme has saved countless lives. It's our wall of defence against this disease, and it's helping us to learn to live with COVID. So in terms of the changes we're announcing today, I've accepted the most recent advice from the JCVI, that's our group of independent clinical advisors on vaccinations, that we should offer a spring booster dose to those that are 75 or over, those that are residents of elderly people's care homes, and those that are most vulnerable. And this will start from today. It will be the dose recommended is approximately 6 months from your previous dose, and the NHS will contact you. It's about 5 million people in total, and you'll be able to then go online or by phone and make your booking.
I'm not quite near 75 just yet, but in a few months, thank you for chuckling, but in a few months' time, will it reach people of slightly lesser years? Secretary of State?
Well, we're led by the advice by our expert advisors that obviously keep the situation under close review. At this point in time, in terms of a spring booster dose, it's just this cohort of people that I've talked about, again, around 5 million people in total. And the reason, by the way, Nick, for that is that we know already that for older people, for those that have weakened immune systems, you are more vulnerable to this virus, and that's why we are targeting this spring booster dose in this way. As for a more broader sort of booster rollout, the JCVI have said they are considering at this point a booster dose for over 50s in the autumn, but there's no final decision on that at this point in time.
I doubt I need to tell you or your colleagues of events in China, but just to recap for the benefit of my listeners, there are concerns. The numbers are now being seen at the highest rate since the end of 2019. Shanghai, they're closing schools. They're even looking to close Shanghai Disney. Is it coming back, Secretary of State?
No, I think the situation in China and Hong Kong, for that matter, where they're seeing something similar, it is very, very different to what we have here. And that is that both of those places have followed what they call a sort of zero COVID policy. They tried to keep COVID out completely. And with Omicron, it's obvious that's just not possible. It's far too contagious. The second problem that they're facing is that in terms of vaccination rates, especially amongst older people who are, as I said earlier, are more vulnerable, they're much, much lower than our vaccination rates. We've been very fortunate that British people have really come together and taken up the offer of vaccines. Over 90% of people vaccinated. When you look at Hong Kong, for instance, my understanding is around 2/3 of people over the age of 80 are not vaccinated at all. And that is sadly why we're seeing an increase in hospitalizations and deaths in that part of the world. The situation here is very, very different.
So as far as we know, it's not a new strain. It's the fact that the United Kingdom, particularly England, have been able to get ahead of the game as regards Omicron.
Yes, with vaccinations,
okay.
With our testing offer, with the antivirals, but most of all, by far and away, is the wall of protection built by the vaccine program.
If I might, can I move you to other matters as a senior member of the government? When you witness or you read about Putin's demanding or ordering bombs to rain down now on schools, on care homes, and forced deportations, it would appear, of some people down in Mariupol, is he a war criminal, Mr. Javid?
Look, I'm appalled by the atrocities that are unfolding in Ukraine and the despicable attacks that we're seeing on civilians. Whether he's a war criminal, I mean, I look. These are the, as far as I'm concerned, these are the acts of a war criminal. In terms of how he's held to account for that, that will be a really, really important job for the International Criminal Court. And I was pleased to see that last week that my colleague, the Deputy Prime Minister, went out to The Hague to speak to the Chief Prosecutor there and to offer all the support the UK can offer the court there in terms of gathering evidence.
It is reported by the United Nations some 10 million Ukrainians, roughly a quarter of the population, are now in some way, shape or form on the move. It's also reported that as regards arrival in the United Kingdom, red tape is holding some of these people up. There are even reports that they're sleeping in the streets or sleeping in forests or whatever it might be. Have you got any numbers or reaction to that, Health Secretary?
Well, I'm pleased that we are supporting Ukraine in every single way that we can, whether that's military aid, humanitarian aid, or indeed, as you have just talked about, Nick, about providing sanctuary for those that are fleeing Ukraine. We have two programs in place to do that at this point in time. One is the family reunion program, where my understanding is that the weekend there were around 9,500 visas issued. And then there's the hosting a Ukrainian family program, where some 150,000 people have registered their interest. And it's important that we continue to help in that way. I expect that we will see hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians arrive here in the UK, and they will get all the support that they need.
Why is it necessary they have a visa prior to arrival? I understand we're the only country on earth that is requesting that, or certainly in Europe, I should say, certainly in Europe.
Well, we've our process has changed on this significantly in the last couple of weeks. Now it is a online only process. The visa is issued online, and before we were with visas in general, we required biometric tests before people arrived in the UK, and now that can be done once you are already in the UK, up to some 6 months after your arrival.
But why is it necessary? Other European countries are not requiring. I hear that it's been made easier, absolutely, but why is it still necessary, Secretary of State?
I would say two things. One is very just at a practical level, that with Ukrainians that are understandably fleeing to Poland and Romania and other places on the border, that is part of Europe's Schengen zone, so they're just not able to put in any kind of process of that type, even if they wanted to. The second reason to have some level, even if it's at a basic, simple level, like I've just described, of security checks is just a sensible thing to do, because we do know that extremist groups and organizations operate in the region. We also know already that the Russians have in the past tried to infiltrate our country to cause us harm. We saw that with Salisbury. I saw that with Salisbury as the Home Secretary at the time. And having some basic level of checks, I just think is common sense. But doing them in a way like we set out recently in a very proportionate way, so people can get here, get to safety, and do the checks afterwards.
You reference your period as Home Secretary. Let me remind my listeners, of course, you also served as Chancellor. Would you support a cut in fuel duty by perhaps 5p later this week from your colleague, Mr. Sunak?
Well, you said I served as Chancellor. That was in the past tense, so I'm no longer Chancellor. So one of the benefits of no longer being a Chancellor is I don't really have to directly answer those questions as I used to before.
But you must have a view, even as an individual.
I tell you what my view is. My view is that it's great that previous chancellors, including this one, have frozen fuel duty for the last 11 years, and that freeze in free duty is saving thousands of pounds for families up and down the country, and that is good. In terms of what happens next, that's clearly a decision for the Chancellor.
And lastly, one role you've yet to have is Prime Minister. The current incumbent said at the weekend he almost seemed to liken the struggle of Ukraine to voting Brexit. Was he right, Secretary of State?
He wasn't doing that. Look, I've heard this. What he was doing, the Prime Minister, was just talking about the general desire of all people to want self-determination, no matter what their situation, what country they're in. People have a strong desire for self-determination. He was not making any kind of direct comparison between the situation in Ukraine and the UK.
And lastly, it is said he wants to go to Kyiv in line with some other European leaders. Were you PM? Would you go to Kyiv? Or, as Health Secretary and one of his close colleagues, would you urge he does go to Kyiv? Secretary of State.
Look, in terms of our Prime Minister and support for Ukraine, I struggle to see how he could provide even more support than we're currently doing. Where it's military, it's humanitarian, it's sanctuary. The UK is doing more than almost any other country. Doesn't it send a heck of a
message, though, doesn't it? For the British PM to be seen in Kyiv, presumably shaking hands with, or his arm around the Ukrainian president, that's a message for Putin, isn't it?
Well, let's see what happens. And normally it's not a good idea to talk about the Prime Minister's future travel plans.
Grateful for your time as ever. Sajid Javid, Health Secretary, appearing here on LBC, where at 1 minute after 8 news is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, And
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Ukraine says there can be no talk of surrender in the besieged city of Mariupol. Officials have rejected Russia's demand that Ukrainian forces lay down their arms